Mel, everybody, I'm Cantonese Cat. Hey everybody, Cantonese Cat here. A lot of chatters about the 4-year cycles. Obviously, it's been playing out very well over and over again. For Bitcoin, usually it comes at an odd year. For example, towards the end of 2013 was the end of that cycle. Towards the end of 2017 was the end of that cycle. Towards the end of 2021 was the end of the cycle. So this 4-year cycle thing has been playing extremely well. What if it does play out? Does that mean that the end of the cycle is going to come here towards the end of this year? That's entirely possible. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to say that makes me feel that it may not be the case. And this could be a little bit controversial because a lot of folks are saying, hey, how can you say that this time is different? This time is different if the liquidity cycle looks different. That's kind of all I have to say about it. Because I actually don't think that Bitcoin necessarily care about the 4-year halving cycle as much, especially once it becomes a more popular asset. I just don't think that the halving effects is going to be as impactful anymore. On top of that, Bitcoin halving basically just means that miners make half the rewards, but they've been halving and halving and halving. It's been already halving for a very long time. So I actually think that the halving effects is not going to be that significant as time goes on. Also, when it comes to increasing the adoption of Bitcoin is going to continue to follow global liquidity rather than follow Bitcoin cycles in isolation. That is my theory. If you're looking at the global liquidity, you can see that previously during these cycle tops over here, that was a pretty significant top, or at least near within a few months of the significant top for the liquidity cycle. Right here, basically a few months later, that was a top liquidity cycle, and it had spent about the next year and a half trying to break above the liquidity cycle resistance over here before global liquidity continues to go up. When that happens, that's generally when the bear market happens. When you have a breakout of the global liquidity and maybe a little bit of a backtest of global liquidity to have increasing global liquidity, that's when the parabolic phase of Bitcoin happens as well. And you can see that was also a pretty significant top here within a few months. That was the top of that liquidity cycle, where global liquidity just ended up getting stuck here underneath resistance here for another year and a half or so. And that's when you had the bear market of Bitcoin, right? And whenever you broke above and back tested and have a parabolic move up, that's when you have to move up here for Bitcoin to the next level over here. So far, what's been happening? Well, what's been happening is that we've been stuck underneath the global liquidity resistance here for a lot longer than usual. Before, it was about maybe a year and a half, 2 years, somewhere around there, year and a half here. Here, we've been stuck here for about 2.5 years, broke out and backtest over the third year. This cycle just looks longer, and this bear market also looked longer. This cup also looked longer here. And I think there's really a reason for why this cycle doesn't look that parabolic here so far, is because the global liquidity just simply hasn't really had that true breakout until recently, until really back in around mid-2024, and it really backtest towards the end of last year, early this year. So the global liquidity has really started to kind of break out here for about half a year or so. And there may be a little bit of delay in terms of what Bitcoin is doing here as well. But Bitcoin follows market symmetry. Arc, rejection, push through, rejection, push through, backtest, arc, rejection, push through, backtest, arc, rejection, right, push through, backtest here. So where's it going to go? Let's say, for example, if this turns out to be a 4-year cycle, then Bitcoin could potentially end here at the horizontal gain line over here around 200,000. And that could potentially be a significant resistance zone over here. It wouldn't necessarily make it quite to the arc up here by the end of the 4-year cycle or whatever. But that could be a resistance zone. We can end up getting stalled out here for quite some time before making a move up next, right? That would still technically be relatively close to what we're talking about, because that would maybe towards the end of the year. You're talking about 200,000 Bitcoin. Everybody's getting scared at that point, thinking the cycle is going to be over. The next thing you know, it decides just wants to push up here to the next arc, get everybody excited. That's also a possibility, right? Not every single time. Like you just can't expect the same thing to happen over and over again without necessarily looking at what the overall market and what the global liquidity is actually doing. The other point I also want to argue is this. I don't think the cycle is over yet, because if you also look at the Ichimoku, whenever things are just riding along the tank and the blue line up here, the bull cycle continues, right? Here, it was riding blue line up here for a very long time, and it just continues to go up here. Here, you end up having a breakdown here back in mid-2021, and you have a little bit of a false breakout here again, but eventually you end up breaking down underneath the blue line. That was the end of the bull cycle. Here, there are no signs that the blue line is being broken under, really. On top of that, every single cycle have that parabolic bull phase, which we simply just really haven't had quite just yet. And during that, you have the monthly Bollinger Band continue to expand to the upside and to the downside. The lower Bollinger Band goes all the way down to the negatives. We haven't really had that, whereas the last two cycles, you have that over and over again, right? So are you saying that the cycle is different, right? I don't necessarily buy into the notion that that's the case. The other thing, too, I also want to point out, last cycle ended up here in November 2021. And you have a little bit of a higher high over here, but the trend here was a little bit exhausted. Here, a lot of people are kind of draw parallels between what happened here versus what happened here. And I think that's a little bit misguided, again, because the Ichimoku looks completely different, right? Because the Bollinger Band looks completely different. And also on top of that, if you're also looking at liquidity, and there's no better way to look at liquidity than to look at Chinese liquidity. How do you look at Chinese liquidity? Well, you can look at Chinese liquidity by looking at the Hang Seng Index, right, which is HSI here. This is really, the Hang Seng Index is really the key index for the Chinese market to give you a better idea in terms of what the Chinese liquidity is really doing. And if you line up the two together the best you can, I'm going to try to line it as best as I can here. There you go. Now, what I'm trying to say here was last time, right before Bitcoin tops, what happened was you have Bitcoin forming a little bit of an exhaustive higher high here, but the Chinese market has already plummeted. The Chinese top was already back in February 2021, right? The global liquidity just simply wasn't there to support further push up on Bitcoin. Whereas this time is different because you have higher highs and higher lows, and it looks like Hang Seng wants to keep going up higher, right? And that coincides with Bitcoin wants to keep going up higher. There's enough global liquidity here to support that. The other thing to look into was also not just Hang Seng Index, but also look at IWM. There is a huge correlate usually because Bitcoin is cyclical, and IWM, which is Russell 2000, which are small cap stocks that are highly dependent on debt, highly dependent on global liquidity and US liquidity. Generally, Bitcoin correlates extremely well with IWM. IWM is not looking like it's topping. Last time when you have the Bitcoin top over here, IWM looks exhausted, looks like a distributed top over here, right? When you were talking about back in July 2021, it's exactly where right there, right? Where Bitcoin is right there. And next thing you know, you just end up plummeting down afterwards, right? Bitcoin end up plummeting down together with it. Are we having the same look where it looks like we just had a parabolic move up with a exhaustion, with a parabolic move, with a distributed top right here? No, we are not. We end up pushing up here back in November, and we end up finding huge resistance when previous all-time high got rejected, came back all the way down here to grab liquidity back in April, and there was a lot of demand here that has been shown. Because we have a lot of demand, we have a V-shaped recovery to push price up higher. And we are looking like we got really, really good reaction on the way down. It looks like it really wants to kind of push above all-time high to keep going here with this V-shaped recovery. Right now, because of this morphology, it looks completely different from what it did over here. This looks like accumulation, actually, and this looks like distribution. To me, I think that it just seems very unlikely for Bitcoin to top within the next few months because IWM is doing a lot of chart repairing and looking like it wants to do a V-shaped recovery. It wants to challenge some previous all-time high over here over the next few months. That's what it looks like to me, right? Very, very different morphology. Now, another thing I also think that is important to look at is the ARK fund. ARK fund is basically also another sentiment gauge here. And if you're looking at what happened last time with ARK, whenever you end up having this top here in April, the ARK fund top was back in February 2021, right? Just like China, and it just kept on going down. It was a big distributed top over here. And Bitcoin made a little bit of a higher high here, but it was an exhaustive top here as well. Are we having the same morphology where ARK just already made a parabolic move up here, look exhausted and trending down already? No, we're not. We're making higher highs and higher lows. And right now, if anything, the ARK price movement looks like it's getting a little bit more parabolic and getting a little bit more impulsive here. And same thing goes with Bitcoin. It looks like Bitcoin is going to probably end up going higher if liquidity is shown by something that is more risk on, like the ARK fund here is looking like it wants to increase. Then I think Bitcoin would continue to go up as well, and it might even continue to follow a parabola like ARK funds over here. Maybe Bitcoin end up getting a little bit more impulsive here on the move on the way up as well. So because of a lot of these different things that I'm seeing here, between the fact that just logically speaking, I just don't see why it has to keep on following the Bitcoin halving cycles, why it has to be towards the end of this odd year, 2025, that's the end of the bull cycle. We're not seeing that with China. We're not seeing that with IWM. We're also not seeing that with ARK funds. So I'm a little bit more skeptical in terms of the 4-year cycle theory. And honestly, the ANDs, even though, you know, you're talking about, oh, the cycle's always been like that. Well, there really hasn't been that many cycles, to be honest, right? There really hasn't been that many cycles for Bitcoin. What, like 1, 2, and 3? So we will have to see how this time is working out. I think it's very critical to look at what other cycle-dependent assets such as IWM is doing, and this cycle for IWM is also extremely long. This is an extremely long IWM cycle that has not been experienced previously here as well. So take that with a grain of salt, you know, pay attention to what the market is doing and make your best decisions. But I am going to follow the trend for Bitcoin based on all the indicators I'm looking at. Looks like it wants to have some very bullish continuation that goes beyond the next few months. And I'm going to plan accordingly and see where it takes me, guys. All right, guys, take care. Bye.